The Hall of Resonance had been designed to make visitors feel small in the most elegant way possible. Isaac Carter noticed that within 3 seconds of entering it and resented the architecture immediately. The ceiling arched so high above him that it seemed less like a roof and more like a private sky. A luminous dome threaded with silver currents that carried soft waves of living light from one end of the chamber to the other. Tall crystal pillars rose in graceful spirals, their surfaces shifting with pale blue symbols that recorded every word spoken in the court. Between them floated narrow platforms of polished black stone, suspended a few inches above the floor by gravitic fields that hummed so quietly they felt like a thought rather than a sound. It was, Isaac had to admit, magnificent. It was also the worst possible place to discover that his palms were sweating through diplomatic gloves. "Breathe," he muttered to himself. His translator drone, a disk of gold no larger than a dinner plate, rotated near his shoulder and repeated in perfect Elyndrian, "Respiratory function advised." Several heads turned. Isaac closed his eyes for half a second. "Thank you, very helpful." "Gratitude acknowledged," the drone replied. A few of the court attendants glanced at one another. One of them, Isaac thought, might have been suppressing amusement. He decided to count that as a victory. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a circular dais of white stone, Queen Seris sat upon a throne that did not quite touch the platform beneath it. The seat hovered in a ring of faint silver light, elegant and severe, much like the woman upon it. She looked almost human at first glance, as all Elyndrians did, but the illusion never held for long. Her ears were long and finely shaped, curving back through dark hair braided with thin strands of metal that shimmered like starlight. Her features were composed with such still precision that they seemed sculpted rather than born. The only softness in her was found in her eyes, luminous and pale, like moonlight passing through water. At her right stood Princess Nira. Isaac had been warned about the child for most of the morning in tones normally reserved for unstable reactors and sacred relics. "Do not approach too quickly. Do not address her directly unless addressed first. Do not make sudden movements. Do not offer physical contact under any circumstances." He had assumed they were exaggerating to impress upon him the delicacy of court life. Now, seeing the girl standing silent beside her mother, he realized they had not exaggerated nearly enough. Nira was small for her age, wrapped in a pale ceremonial tunic, woven with lines of reactive fiber that glimmered faintly when she moved, though she barely moved at all. Her ears were long like her mother's, though less severe, giving her face an almost fragile elegance. She kept her hands folded tightly in front of her, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the assembled court, as though the hall and everyone in it existed behind glass. There was no curiosity in her expression, no impatience, no childish restlessness. That absence was somehow more unsettling than any tantrum could have been. A child should not have been that quiet. Isaac adjusted the data prism in his hands and tried not to stare. To either side of the chamber stood the court itself, ministers in layered silver robes, military commanders with dark armored collars, scientific advisors wearing bands of floating interface lights around their wrists. Behind them waited royal guards, motionless and armed with elegant spears that were definitely ceremonial in the same way a meteor strike was weather. This, Isaac reminded himself, was still a scientific presentation, a very important one. Yes, one delivered before the ruling court of an interstellar monarchy currently balancing grief, political instability, and suspicion of off-world influence, yes. But scientifically speaking, it was simply a report. He had survived dissertation defense on Earth. He had once explained xenobiological mating displays to a funding committee that included his ex-girlfriend and a man who had fallen asleep with his eyes open. Compared to that, this should have been manageable. The chamber quieted further as a herald struck the floor with a resonant staff. A clear note rang through the hall and spread invisible circles of blue light across the polished stone. Queen Seris inclined her head by exactly the amount required to recognize his existence without suggesting familiarity. "Dr. Isaac Carter," she said. Her voice was calm, low, and carried effortlessly. It did not echo, yet somehow reached every corner of the chamber. "You were invited to Elyndra to present your findings on interspecies emotional adaptation among neural empathic civilizations. You may begin. Isaac bowed with care. He had practiced the motion all night and still felt like a folding chair. Your Majesty, he said. Honored court. The translator drone repeated him, this time without humiliating him. He activated the prism. A lattice of light unfolded above his palm, projecting rotating models of neural structures, spectral maps, and field diagrams into the air between the pillars. Several scholars leaned forward immediately. Good, Isaac thought. Scientists, familiar territory. Lovely. My research, he began, focuses on the way intelligent species process trust after collective trauma, particularly when neurological systems are adapted for empathic resonance. He walked slowly as he spoke, the projections following him like obedient ghosts. Images expanded and shifted at a gesture. Human neural scans, Elyndrian sensory matrices, comparative diagrams of emotional feedback loops. At a biological level, trust is never purely abstract. It is chemical, electrical, behavioral. It is learned, but it is also felt. For species such as the Elyndrians, whose neural architecture appears unusually receptive to ambient emotional patterning, this process is even more complex. He risked a glance toward the Queen. She listened without interruption. The ministers looked skeptical. The scholars looked hungry. The guards looked ready to spear any sentence they disliked. Reasonable audience. As many of you know, Isaac continued, humans are not an empathic species in the formal sense. We do not perceive emotional harmonics directly. In fact, many of us struggle to perceive emotions even when another human is crying directly in front of us. One elderly scholar blinked. Isaac lifted a hand. It is not our finest trait. There was a tiny stir in the court. Not laughter exactly, but the distant cousin of laughter, the sort diplomacy permitted in public. Encouraged, he continued. However, humans do emit consistent physiological signals tied to emotional states. Heart rhythm variation, skin conductivity, micro-expressions, vocal fluctuation. Under the right conditions, these can create stable patterns that an empathic species may interpret as unusually transparent or unusually loud. His display shifted, showing color-threaded models of a human nervous system beside the elegant radiating webs of an Elyndrian one. In simpler terms, he said, standing near a human may feel less like reading a sealed archive and more like being handed a diary with bad handwriting. That got a few actual smiles. Even Queen Seris's expression changed by the smallest fraction, enough that Isaac nearly lost his place. Wonderful, he thought. I'm charming in a death palace. He went on, more confident now, speaking of recovery pathways after trauma, of the possibility that cross-species interaction could interrupt emotional isolation in unexpected ways, of how unfamiliar presence sometimes felt safer than familiar expectation. The hall listened. The symbols on the pillars brightened, recording his words into living memory. Outside the vast windows behind the throne, the sky of Elyndra shimmered violet and gold, crowded with air traffic streams and the distant silhouette of orbital rings. Then Isaac made the mistake of trying one more joke. Of course, he said, rotating a model of a human cortex, further research is needed, preferably research that does not involve my species attempting diplomacy through casseroles, because history suggests that ends unpredictably. His translator paused. The court paused. Isaac frowned at the drone. You translated casseroles, right? The drone answered. Closest equivalent, ceremonial grief pudding. A sound escaped Isaac before he could stop it. It was very nearly a laugh. That is not remotely the same thing. And then, in the sudden stillness that followed, something moved. Not a guard, not a scholar, not one of the attendants. Princess Nira stepped away from her mother. It was such a small motion that Isaac almost missed it, but the reaction it caused was immediate. Two guards straightened, a minister inhaled sharply. Queen Seris did not move at all, which somehow made the moment feel more dangerous. Nira descended from the dais with slow, unhurried steps. Isaac's mind emptied itself with astonishing speed. He had been told not to approach her. He was fairly certain the protocol guide had not covered what to do if she approached him. Bow? Stand still? Continue speaking about grief, pudding, and hope for mercy? The girl crossed the shining floor while every eye in the chamber followed her. Her expression had changed. The distant blankness was gone. In its place was something stranger and infinitely more fragile. Attention. Careful, searching attention, as if she were listening to a sound no one else could hear. She stopped directly in front of him. Isaac looked down, then very carefully lowered the prism projection. Princess, Nira stared at him for one long second. Then she threw her arms around him. The data prism slipped from his hand, bounced once on the floating platform, and projected a rotating neural diagram directly into the stunned silence of the royal court. For a moment, Isaac Carter became the quietest object in the entire royal court. He did not move. He did not breathe very much either. His brain, which had spent the last 10 years analyzing alien neural pathways and cataloging exotic microbial life on 3 different moons, had suddenly decided that none of that experience applied to the current situation. An alien princess was hugging him, not politely touching his arm, not curiously examining his sleeve, hugging him. Her small arms were wrapped firmly around his waist, her head pressed lightly against his chest as if this were the most normal action in the galaxy. The court looked as though someone had pressed a universal pause button. Isaac became aware of 3 things at once. First, his translator drone had stopped rotating and was hovering in stunned silence. Second, at least 6 royal guards had shifted their stance and were now gripping their energy spears in ways that suggested they were debating several extremely fast solutions. Third, his dropped data prism was still projecting a rotating model of the human brain directly above the princess's head. The glowing cortex slowly spun. Isaac cleared his throat carefully. "Hello," he said. The translator drone woke up just in time to repeat it. Across the hall, several nobles blinked. Princess Nira did not let go. If anything, she hugged him slightly tighter. Isaac glanced toward the queen. Queen Seris had risen from her throne. She had not moved otherwise. Her posture was still perfectly controlled, her expression composed in the calm authority expected of a ruler whose decisions shaped entire star systems. Yet something had shifted in her eyes. Shock was there. Not anger, not yet, but shock. Isaac tried very carefully not to make any sudden movements that could accidentally start an interplanetary incident. "Well," he murmured quietly to the girl, "this is unexpected." Nira tilted her head slightly without releasing him. Her long ears brushed the front of his research jacket. "You are loud," she said. The translation drone repeated it clearly across the chamber. Isaac blinked. "I apologize?" She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her eyes were bright now, focused with intense curiosity. "Not with your voice," she said. "Inside." Isaac opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded slowly like a scientist encountering a very strange data point. "Ah," he said, "that kind of loud." Behind him, someone in the court whispered something urgent in Elyndrian. Another voice responded sharply. The guards had taken a single careful step closer. Isaac raised both hands slightly in what he hoped looked like harmless confusion. "I promise I did not plan this," he said. The translator drone relayed it with flawless clarity. Princess Nira ignored the entire court. "You are not quiet like the others," she said. "Most people have mentioned that," Isaac admitted. A tiny smile appeared on her face. It was small, fragile, but unmistakably real. Several members of the court visibly stiffened. One of the royal scholars dropped a data slate. Queen Seris finally stepped down from the dais. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind that carried the full weight of royal authority. Her long ceremonial cloak drifted slightly behind her as the gravitic field beneath the platform adjusted to her stride. The court parted instantly. Isaac had the strange impression that the entire hall had begun orbiting around the woman approaching them. She stopped several paces away. For a long moment she said nothing. Her gaze moved from Isaac to her daughter and back again. Princess Nira was still holding on to him. Queen Seris spoke at last. "Release him, Nira." The command was calm, gentle even, but it was unmistakably a queen's voice. The girl did not move. Isaac resisted the powerful urge to slowly dissolve into the floor. Nira looked toward her mother, but did not step away. "I like him," she said simply. The translator drone announced it to the entire court. Silence followed, a very deep silence. Isaac raised one hand slightly. In fairness, he said carefully, this is the first time anyone has said that during one of my presentations. The drone translated it. For a fraction of a second, no one reacted. Then somewhere among the scholars, a soft laugh escaped before its owner could stop it. It spread quickly. Tiny, suppressed sounds quickly buried, but present. Even a few guards looked uncertain whether they were still supposed to be intimidating. Queen Seris studied Isaac with the focus of someone examining a rare and possibly dangerous phenomenon. Dr. Carter, she said. Yes, Your Majesty. Have you made physical contact with my daughter before this moment? Absolutely not. Did you invite this interaction? Not intentionally. Princess Nira looked up at Isaac. You told a joke, she said. Isaac blinked again. That is true. You are strange, she continued. Also true. The Queen's gaze narrowed slightly. Explain. Isaac shifted carefully, aware that the princess still had one hand gripping his jacket. Well, he said slowly, my research suggests that humans produce unusually strong emotional signals compared to empathic species like the Elyndrians. Your daughter may be perceiving those signals more clearly than most. Nira nodded immediately. Yes. Isaac pointed gently at her. See? Scientific confirmation. The translator drone relayed this with complete seriousness. A few more scholars were now very openly interested. Queen Seris's attention did not leave Isaac's face. You are suggesting, she said, that my daughter approached you because of a neurological resonance. I am suggesting, Isaac replied carefully, that my species is emotionally noisy, and she might find that easier to hear. Nira tugged lightly on his sleeve. You are warm too. Isaac sighed. That also happens. The court watched in absolute disbelief. Queen Seris's expression softened for the briefest moment as she looked at her daughter. Then she straightened again. Dr. Carter, she said. Yes, Your Majesty. You will remain in the palace. Isaac blinked. Remain? Until we understand why my daughter, who has not willingly touched another person since the death of her father, has decided to hug a human scientist in the middle of my court. Isaac considered that. That seems scientifically reasonable. Nira squeezed his arm again. The Queen turned slightly toward the assembled nobles. Dr. Carter will be granted temporary residence within the Royal Research Wing. No one argued. No one even breathed loudly. Isaac glanced down at the princess still standing beside him. Well, he said quietly, that escalated quickly. Nira looked pleased. You are staying. Isaac looked across the vast chamber, at the stunned court, the hovering throne, and the most powerful queen in the system, studying him like a complicated puzzle. He rubbed his forehead. I was supposed to present 3 more slides. The Royal Research Wing of the Elyndrian Palace was the sort of place that made human laboratories look like poorly organized kitchens. Isaac Carter realized this approximately 30 seconds after entering it, and immediately decided that he liked it very much. Transparent corridors curved through open chambers filled with hovering instruments, softly humming consoles, and walls made of living crystal that shifted color depending on the data flowing through them. Entire sections of the room floated at different heights, connected by slow-moving gravity platforms that rose and lowered like patient elevators. Above everything stretched a glass dome that revealed the violet sky of Elyndra and the distant silver arcs of orbital traffic. Isaac stood in the middle of it with his hands on his hips. Well, he said quietly, this is absurdly beautiful. His translator drone floated beside him. Observation acknowledged, it replied. Behind him, small footsteps echoed across the polished floor. Princess Nira had followed him. Of course she had. She walked slowly through the chamber with wide, curious eyes, touching the air where the faint holographic projections drifted between workstations. Unlike the silent statue she had been in the royal court, here she seemed alive with curiosity. Isaac watched her for a moment. You know, he said gently, most royal children probably spend their time in gardens or music halls. Nira looked at a rotating model of a molecular structure and tilted her head. This is better, Isaac smiled. That is the correct answer. One of the palace researchers stood nearby, pretending to examine a data panel while very obviously observing them. Two others whispered beside a hovering console. Word had spread quickly. The human who had been hugged by the princess was now working in the royal laboratories. Isaac ignored the audience and activated one of the research platforms. A set of floating screens lit up around him, displaying neurological maps and emotional field readings he had collected during the court presentation. Nira leaned forward immediately. "What is that?" "This," Isaac said proudly, "is a map of how brains behave when people trust each other." She blinked. "It looks messy." Isaac nodded. "Yes, that is because people are messy." He expanded the projection, revealing two overlapping patterns of colored energy threads. The blue signals represent Elyndrian empathic pathways. Very organized, elegant, stable. Nira nodded approvingly. "And the red signals?" she asked. Isaac hesitated. "Those are human emotions." She stared at the chaotic web of lines twisting across the projection. "They look broken." Isaac rubbed the back of his neck. "That is also a valid interpretation." Nira began to laugh softly. The sound echoed lightly through the chamber. One of the researchers dropped a stylus. Isaac leaned closer to the projection. "Humans experience emotional signals in bursts, sudden spikes, unpredictable rhythms, lots of interference. Very inefficient system. Why do you have it?" "Evolution," Isaac said, "and poor planning." Nira studied the projection again. "But I can hear it." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Your signals." She tapped the glowing red web floating in the air. "They are loud." Isaac folded his arms thoughtfully. "That matches my theory." "What theory?" "That humans accidentally broadcast emotions like broken radio transmitters." Nira looked impressed. "You are a broken radio?" "Scientifically speaking, yes." She laughed again. Behind them, the palace researchers were now very obviously listening. Isaac continued adjusting the projection. "Your species evolved to perceive emotional resonance fields. Humans did not evolve to hide them." "So I can hear you?" "Probably." "What do you feel right now?" Isaac paused. "Well," he said slowly, "mild scientific curiosity, professional embarrassment, and a growing suspicion that I'm now part of a very strange royal childcare program." The translator drone delivered the sentence perfectly. One of the researchers snorted. Nira looked puzzled. "What is childcare?" "It is when adults try to keep children from doing dangerous things." She considered this. "You are bad at it." Isaac sighed. "Yes." At that moment, a quiet chime echoed through the chamber. The lights shifted slightly. Isaac glanced toward the entrance corridor. Queen Seris stood there. She had entered so quietly that none of them had noticed. The researchers immediately straightened and bowed their heads. Isaac turned and gave a slightly awkward nod. "Your Majesty." The Queen observed the scene carefully. The floating neural projections, the scattered instruments, her daughter standing beside the human scientist with clear interest in her eyes. Her gaze lingered briefly on Nira. The princess was smiling. It was a small smile, but it changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Seris stepped forward slowly. "What are you studying?" she asked. Isaac gestured toward the projection. "Emotional resonance patterns," Nira answered before he could continue. "He is a broken radio." Isaac closed his eyes briefly. "That is an oversimplification." The Queen looked at the chaotic red neural pattern, then at Isaac. "Accurate?" He considered it. "Reasonably." For a moment, the Queen looked as though she might laugh. She did not, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly. Nira tugged Isaac's sleeve again. "Tell the joke," Isaac groaned. "Which joke?" "The pudding one." The Queen raised an eyebrow. Isaac looked between them and sighed. "Well," he said, "apparently your translator turned a human food called casserole into ceremonial grief pudding." Nira burst into laughter. The researchers tried very hard not to. Queen Seris looked at Isaac for a long moment. Then she asked calmly, "Dr. Carter, are humans always this strange?" Isaac thought about it. "Yes," he said, "consistently." Isaac Carter had never intended to become the most discussed human in the Elyndrian palace. Unfortunately, the palace had decided otherwise. 3 days after the incident in the royal court, the research wing had quietly transformed into something between a laboratory and a public observation exhibit. Scholars appeared far more often than necessary. Technicians found very creative reasons to calibrate equipment in Isaac's vicinity. Even a few royal advisors had wandered through pretending to be deeply interested in xenobiological data. Isaac noticed all of it. He also noticed that Princess Nira noticed none of it. She was currently lying on her stomach on a floating analysis platform, her feet gently kicking the air while she watched a rotating hologram of a human brain. "This one looks confused," she announced. Isaac leaned against a console with a cup of steaming Elyndrian tea that tasted suspiciously like mint and electricity. "That one is confused," he said. "That scan was taken during a human political debate." Nira looked impressed. "Did the brain survive?" "Barely." The translator drone repeated the conversation, while two scholars at the far side of the room tried very hard to look like they were not listening. Nira pointed at another neural pattern. "And this one?" "That," Isaac said proudly, "is a human brain trying to assemble furniture." She studied the chaotic web of flashing signals. "It is worse. Much worse." The princess laughed again, the sound light and genuine. Isaac watched the projection spin slowly. "You know," he said, "your species has an extremely elegant neural architecture. Very efficient emotional regulation. Humans are less organized." "You are messy radios," Nira said confidently. "Yes." She seemed satisfied with that explanation. A moment later, the floating platform shifted slightly as someone stepped onto the gravitic floor nearby. Isaac didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The room had developed a very noticeable habit of becoming quieter whenever Queen Seris entered. He glanced over his shoulder. She stood at the edge of the laboratory chamber, observing with the same composed stillness she carried everywhere. Her long ears caught the light from the crystal walls and the faint glow of the palace data systems reflected in her pale eyes. Isaac lifted his tea slightly. "Your Majesty, Dr. Carter." Her gaze moved from him to her daughter. Nira had rolled onto her back and was now watching the projection upside down. "Mother," the princess said calmly, "his brain is broken." Isaac covered his face with one hand. "Scientifically misrepresented," he muttered. Queen Seris stepped closer, examining the holographic neural display. "This is the emotional structure of your species?" "Yes." She studied the tangled signals for several seconds. "It appears unstable. That is the polite word for it." The queen tilted her head slightly. "And yet my daughter finds it comforting." Isaac shrugged. "My working theory is that humans broadcast emotional signals very loudly. Your species is used to subtle empathic patterns. Compared to Elyndrians, humans probably feel like standing next to a glowing lantern." Nira sat up immediately. "Yes," Isaac pointed at her. "Peer-reviewed confirmation." The queen looked at the projection again. "Your emotions are chaotic, also accurate, and you make jokes while explaining them." Isaac thought about that. "Yes, that part is cultural." Nira slid off the platform and walked over to Isaac. "You should tell the gravity joke." Isaac frowned. "What gravity joke?" "The one when you floated." Isaac groaned quietly. "That was not a joke. That was an accident." Nira grabbed his sleeve and looked at her mother. He activated the training device and drifted into the ceiling. The queen raised an eyebrow. Isaac sighed. "It turns out Elyndrian gravity calibration fields are extremely sensitive." Nira demonstrated by lifting her arms and pretending to float upward. "You said, this is not ideal." One of the observing scholars choked on a laugh. Isaac pointed accusingly toward the ceiling. Scientific curiosity was involved. The queen looked up briefly. "Your species cannot control local gravity?" "Not without machines." "That seems inconvenient." Isaac nodded. "It is one of several flaws." Nira tugged his sleeve again. "You should try again." "No." "Yes." "No." "Maybe." The princess smiled triumphantly. Queen Seris watched the exchange carefully. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly. "Nira." "Yes, mother." "You have spent 3 days following Dr. Carter through the research wing." "Yes." "You have not done that with anyone else." Nira thought about the question. "Others are quiet." Isaac folded his arms. "I have been called many things, but quiet has never been one of them." The queen looked at him. "That appears to be precisely the point." Silence settled over the room again. softer this time. Nira leaned against Isaac's side and looked up at her mother. He feels safe. The sentence landed in the chamber like a small star falling into water. No one spoke. Isaac suddenly found the floating neural projections extremely interesting. Queen Seris remained perfectly still. Her gaze rested on her daughter for a long moment. Then she turned back to Isaac. Dr. Carter? Yes, Your Majesty. You may continue your research here. Isaac blinked. That was already my plan. Her expression remained composed. Good. Nira tugged his sleeve again. Now the gravity joke. Isaac sighed deeply. Fine. He stepped toward the gravitic training platform. If I float into the ceiling again, he said, you are responsible. Nira looked delighted. Queen Seris folded her hands behind her back. For the first time in years, the quiet halls of the palace research wing echoed with laughter again. The palace gardens of Elyndra were not built the way humans built gardens. Isaac Carter discovered this when he attempted to sit on what he assumed was a bench, and instead slowly rotated 90 degrees as the surface adjusted its gravity alignment. He caught himself on the edge just before sliding off. That seems unnecessary, he muttered. Princess Nira, standing beside him, watched with enormous interest. You sat wrong. Isaac adjusted himself carefully as the floating seat corrected its angle again. I sat the way every human in history has sat. Nira shook her head with absolute certainty. Incorrect. Isaac looked around the garden. The place was breathtaking even by interstellar standards. Terraced platforms of pale stone drifted at different heights above shallow pools of glowing water. Plants with translucent leaves shifted color as they absorbed starlight from the sky above. Small hovering drones moved quietly between the trees, maintaining perfect environmental balance. Far above the garden dome, the evening sky of Elyndra shimmered in violet and deep blue. Several distant ships passed through the upper atmosphere like slow-moving comets. Isaac leaned back slightly. Your planet is showing off. Nira walked across the floating path, her feet barely making a sound on the smooth surface. The garden listens. To what? Emotions. Isaac blinked. Of course it does. She pointed toward one of the glowing trees. Its leaves were slowly shifting from soft blue to pale gold. It knows you are calmer. Isaac folded his arms thoughtfully. Either that, he said, or the plant is judging me. Nira looked at the tree. It might be. Isaac nodded seriously. Fair. They walked deeper into the garden. After several days inside the palace research wing, Isaac had begun to notice how the entire palace functioned like a living organism. Walls adapted to movement. Lighting responded to emotional stress levels. Even the air circulation adjusted subtly depending on the number of people in a room. Elyndrian architecture did not simply house life. It participated in it. Nira hopped lightly onto a low hovering platform and sat cross-legged. Tell me about Earth. Isaac sat more cautiously on the edge. Well, he said, Earth is slightly less elegant than this. Do your plants listen? No, our plants mostly mind their own business. That sounds boring. Sometimes they try to kill us, Isaac added. Nira leaned forward immediately. That is better. Isaac smiled. Carnivorous plants, poisonous vines, trees that drop fruit the size of meteorites. She looked delighted. Your planet sounds dangerous. It builds character. The princess swung her feet over the edge of the platform. Do humans hug each other often? Isaac blinked at the sudden question. Yes. How many times per day? That varies. 5? Sometimes. 10. Possibly. 20. Only during family reunions. Nira considered this with great seriousness. That seems inefficient. Isaac raised an eyebrow. Inefficient? Yes. She slid off the platform and walked toward him. If hugging helps people feel safe, you should do it more. Isaac pointed at her. That is exactly what humans say. Nira seemed pleased. You are learning. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped when he noticed someone standing at the entrance of the garden. Queen Seris had arrived quietly again. Isaac was beginning to suspect that Elyndrian rulers came equipped with built-in stealth technology. She walked slowly across the floating path toward them, the soft garden lights reflected in the silver lines woven through her dark hair. Dr. Carter, Your Majesty. Nira ran over to her immediately. Mother, humans hug 20 times. Isaac lifted a finger. That is not statistically verified. Queen Seris regarded him calmly. Is this part of your scientific research? Apparently. Nira crossed her arms thoughtfully. Maybe Elyndrians should try it. Isaac laughed. I am not responsible for interstellar hugging policies. The Queen's expression shifted slightly, somewhere between amusement and disbelief. Dr. Carter, she said, you arrived here to study emotional recovery in empathic species. That was the plan. And now you are explaining human hugging rituals to my daughter. Yes. Why? Isaac rubbed the back of his neck. Because she asked. Nira nodded. Good answer. The Queen looked at her daughter. For a moment, something softer passed across her expression. You seem happier, Sarah said quietly. Nira shrugged. He is loud. Isaac spread his hands. I continue to apologize for that. The Queen's gaze moved to him. You should not. He tilted his head. Why not? Because my daughter has not laughed in 3 years. The garden lights shifted slightly, glowing warmer. Nira leaned against Isaac again without hesitation. He tells strange stories. Isaac sighed. They are educational stories. About killer plants. Scientifically important killer plants. The Queen watched them both for several seconds. Then she stepped closer. Dr. Carter. Yes, Your Majesty? If your research is correct, that is always the hope. Then your presence is helping my daughter recover. Isaac hesitated. That may be happening. And if that is true, she stopped speaking for a moment, as if weighing something far more complicated than a scientific hypothesis. Then I must consider what it means for both of you. Isaac blinked. I was mostly considering dinner. Nira looked excited. Do humans hug before dinner? Isaac groaned. Oh no. Isaac Carter had never imagined that explaining human emotions would eventually involve standing in front of several extremely nervous alien diplomats, while a young princess loudly announced that he was her official friend. Yet that was exactly what was happening. The chamber of the Royal Council was quieter than usual, though the silence felt different now than it had during Isaac's first presentation days earlier. Back then, the court had been cautious and suspicious. Now it was cautious and confused. Isaac suspected this was an improvement. The long oval council table floated a few inches above the floor, its surface displaying shifting constellations of data. Representatives from several neighboring systems had arrived to discuss trade corridors and defensive alliances, though the discussion had stalled the moment Princess Nira had decided to attend the meeting, which she had done, because Isaac was there. He leaned slightly toward the Queen and spoke under his breath. I feel like I may be disrupting diplomacy. Queen Seris did not look at him. You are. Isaac nodded. Good to know. Across the table, one of the visiting diplomats cleared his throat. He belonged to a tall, slender species whose skin reflected faint patterns of violet light. The palace translator drones had labeled his species as the Talin. The Talin ambassador looked at Isaac with careful interest. Your Majesty, he said slowly, this human is the one who has formed a bond with the princess? Before the Queen could answer, Nira spoke. Yes. She pointed directly at Isaac. He is loud. Isaac rubbed his forehead. That description continues to spread. Several diplomats exchanged glances. The Talin ambassador tilted his head. In our culture, he said carefully, a child of the royal blood forming an emotional connection with an off-worlder would be considered significant. Isaac leaned back slightly. Oh, good. The translator drone repeated his words with perfect clarity. Queen Seris finally turned her gaze toward him. Dr. Carter. Yes, Your Majesty. Try not to encourage political interpretations. Isaac spread his hands helplessly. I am simply existing. Nira tugged his sleeve. Tell them the gravity story. Isaac stared at the ceiling for a moment. Why does everyone enjoy that story? Because you floated. The Talin ambassador leaned forward. You floated. Isaac sighed. I accidentally activated an Elyndrian gravity training field and spent 30 seconds drifting near the ceiling. Nira demonstrated again by lifting her arms and pretending to rise. You said, this is not ideal. One of the diplomats laughed before he could stop himself. Queen Seris rested one hand against the table, her expression composed but her eyes slightly brighter than usual. Isaac noticed. He was beginning to notice many small things about the queen. The way she studied conversations before speaking, the way her posture shifted slightly when Nira laughed, the way her long ears tilted when she listened closely. He suspected most people in the court had never seen those details. The Talin ambassador spoke again. "Dr. Carter," he said, "your work involves emotional resonance between species?" "That is correct." "And you believe your presence is helping the princess recover from trauma?" "That appears to be the case." Nira nodded enthusiastically. "He is noisy," Isaac pointed at her. "Peer-reviewed." The diplomat studied Isaac with renewed curiosity. "Humans do not possess empathic neural receptors like the Elyndrians. How does this interaction occur?" Isaac leaned forward slightly. "Humans produce strong physiological emotional signals, heart rhythm changes, vocal microtones, body temperature shifts. Most species filter those signals subconsciously. Elyndrians evolved to detect emotional patterns very clearly." "So the princess perceives your emotional state?" "Yes." "Why would that comfort her?" Isaac thought for a moment. "Because humans are terrible at hiding emotions." Several diplomats exchanged puzzled looks. Isaac shrugged. "When you grow up around people who carefully control their feelings, a human can feel very honest." Nira nodded again. "Yes." The Talin ambassador slowly leaned back. "That is fascinating." Isaac raised a finger. "It is also extremely embarrassing." Queen Seris finally spoke again. "My daughter has not willingly interacted with anyone outside the royal family since the attack that killed her father." The chamber grew quiet. Nira leaned against Isaac's arm without thinking. The queen continued calmly. "And yet she follows this human scientist through the palace laboratories." Isaac gave a small wave. "Hello." Several diplomats smiled despite themselves. The Talin ambassador looked thoughtful. "In my culture," he said slowly, "such a bond would be interpreted as a sign of trust." Queen Seris looked at Isaac again. "Yes." Isaac shifted in his seat. "I am beginning to suspect my research grant did not cover this situation." Nira tugged his sleeve again. "You are staying." Isaac raised an eyebrow. "I did not sign anything." Queen Seris studied him carefully. "Dr. Carter." "Yes, Your Majesty." "You have already altered the atmosphere of this palace more than you realize." Isaac considered the statement. "I apologize." "You should not." The Talin ambassador looked between them. "This situation is unusual," he said. Isaac nodded. "That is the polite word." Nira leaned forward proudly. "He is my official friend." Isaac buried his face in his hands. The translator drone repeated the declaration to the entire council chamber. For several seconds, the diplomats stared at him. Then one of them began laughing. Soon another joined. Even Queen Seris allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Isaac lowered his hands and looked around the room. "Well," he said, "I suppose diplomacy is going well." The Hall of Resonance looked very different to Isaac Carter now. The towering crystal pillars were still there, spiraling upward like frozen lightning. The silver currents still flowed across the ceiling dome, carrying pale light through the chamber. Hundreds of nobles and scholars still stood along the floating platforms that surrounded the central floor. But the silence felt different. The first time Isaac had stood here, the court had looked at him like a potentially dangerous experiment. Now they looked at him like a very confusing houseguest. Isaac adjusted the collar of his research jacket and whispered to the translator drone beside him. "I would like to point out that I originally came here to give a lecture." "Statement recorded," the drone replied. Queen Seris stood upon the floating throne once again, her posture calm, her long ears framed by the soft glow of the chamber lights. Beside her stood Princess Nira, though she was no longer the quiet statue Isaac had first seen days earlier. Now she shifted slightly on her feet with the restless energy of someone trying very hard to be patient. The court had gathered to close the diplomatic summit with several neighboring systems. The Talin representatives stood among the visitors, their violet skin reflecting the shifting lights of the hall. Scholars hovered near the crystal pillars, pretending to review data, while clearly waiting for something far more interesting than trade negotiations. Isaac had a feeling they were about to get it. Queen Seris addressed the court. "Our negotiations are complete," she said calmly. "Trade routes between Elyndra and the Talin systems will reopen. Research exchanges will continue." The Talin ambassador nodded respectfully. "Your Majesty, our people look forward to future cooperation." Isaac leaned slightly toward Nira. "That means everyone survived diplomacy." She nodded. "Good," the Queen continued. "Before we conclude this gathering, there is one final matter." Isaac sighed quietly. "Oh no." The translator drone repeated it. Several scholars smiled. Queen Seris stepped down from the throne platform and approached the center of the chamber. Her gaze moved across the assembled court. "Many of you witnessed the moment several days ago when my daughter approached Dr. Carter during his presentation." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the hall. Isaac rubbed his temple. "I was hoping that would fade into legend." "It already has," the drone informed him. "Great," Queen Seris continued speaking. "My daughter has endured years of silence since the attack that took her father's life." The court grew still. Isaac glanced down at Nira. She stood quietly beside him now, but her expression was calm rather than distant. "She withdrew from our world," the Queen said, "from her teachers, her guardians, and even from me." Her voice did not tremble, but the words carried weight through the chamber. "Yet in a single moment, she chose to trust a stranger." The Queen turned toward Isaac. "A human scientist whose emotional signals, it seems, are impossible to ignore." Isaac lifted one hand. "That remains my leading theory." Soft laughter moved through the court. Nira tugged his sleeve. "You are loud." "Yes." Queen Seris looked at her daughter. "Nira." The princess looked up. "Yes, mother? You may tell the court what you told me yesterday." Nira thought about it carefully. Then she stepped forward. Isaac suddenly realized several hundred people were watching her. She did not seem to notice. "He feels safe," she said. The words echoed through the chamber. Isaac blinked. The Talin ambassador nodded slowly. "Trust," he said quietly. Nira turned toward Isaac. "And humans hug." Isaac covered his face. "Oh no." Before he could protest further, Nira grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the center of the hall. The entire court leaned forward slightly. "Wait," Isaac said. "We should discuss protocol." Too late. Nira wrapped her arms around him again. The chamber froze exactly as it had the first time. Except this time, Isaac did not panic. He laughed softly and returned the hug. "Well," he said quietly, "at least this part is familiar." Then something even more surprising happened. Nira turned and reached for her mother. Queen Seris raised an eyebrow. "Princess!" But Nira was determined. She pulled the queen closer and wrapped one arm around her while still holding Isaac with the other. For a moment, the ruler of Elyndra looked utterly unprepared for the situation. The entire royal court stared in disbelief. Isaac whispered carefully, "I think this is a diplomatic breakthrough." Queen Seris looked at him. "You planned this?" "Absolutely not." Nira squeezed both of them. "Humans say families should hug." The queen closed her eyes briefly. Then, to the amazement of the entire court, she laughed. The sound was soft but clear. The guards relaxed. Scholars smiled openly. Even the visiting diplomats exchanged amused glances. Queen Seris finally stepped back, though the warmth in her expression remained. She looked at Isaac. "Dr. Carter." "Yes, Your Majesty." "You came here to study emotional recovery." "That was the plan. And instead, you helped us remember how to live." Isaac shifted slightly. "I mostly told bad jokes." Nira nodded, "and floated into ceilings." "Scientific accidents," Isaac corrected. Queen Seris regarded him for a long moment. Then she spoke clearly enough for the entire court to hear. "Dr. Isaac Carter of Earth will remain an honored guest of Elyndra for as long as he wishes." Isaac blinked. "That seems generous." Nira smiled proudly. "You are staying." Isaac looked around the hall. The court no longer felt intimidating. The crystal pillars no longer seemed overwhelming. The palace no longer felt like a place of quiet grief. It felt alive. He looked back at Nira. "Well," he said, "someone has to continue the hugging research." The translator drone repeated it perfectly. And for the first time in years, laughter filled the hall of resonance.